So Paulo Costa pulls out of his fight against Aliskerov, which he was never in the first place, if you remember what he said as soon as the fight was announced. And now he's going to be fighting, allegedly, Khamzat Chimaev in October in Abu Dhabi, and that's amazing news. And I also want to go over the fact that MVP is a free agent, and also maybe the UFC is going to be buying Bellator. I'll talk about that in the second half of this video, but we're going to start straight away with this bit of news. First of all, we get the information that Paulo Costa's pulled out of his fight against Aliskerov, which I never really believed as a headline. I know a lot of people sort of like went after Paulo Costa for this, but I was thinking, you know what? I'm going to let this breathe for a bit and see what comes out of it, because I remember as soon as that Aliskerov fight was made by the UFC, Paulo Costa said online, "No, I'm not fighting Aliskerov," and I didn't blame him, because Aliskerov has not earned a shot against Paulo Costa the same way Abbas Magomedov didn't earn a shot against Sean Strickland. And maybe the UFC also had this clarity, which is why they're not too angry at Paulo Costa, because they just saw Abbas Magomedov, who they just tried to jump up the division, get absolutely smoked by Sean Strickland, and maybe they realized that that jump up was a bit of a mistake. So a lot of people were going a bit harsh on Paulo Costa, even though I don't believe that fight was ever going to happen in the first place. But now we have a rumor of Paulo Costa versus Khamzat Chimaev at UFC 294, October 21st. Of course, there were rumors of Khamzat Chimaev versus Jared Cannonier instead, but I think this is a much better matchup than the Cannonier one in terms of the build-up. There's some actual beef between them. Paulo Costa's a much bigger name than Jared Cannonier as well. You don't really want Jared Cannonier to be the guy that beats Chimaev and then gets a title shot against Adesanya, because he's already beaten Khamzat. He's already lost to Israel Adesanya. I know Israel Adesanya has already beaten Paulo Costa as well, but if Paulo Costa beats Khamzat Chimaev, you don't have to give him a title shot. Whereas if Cannonier wins, you kind of have to give him a title shot. So that was sort of the problem that I had with that Khamzat Chimaev Jared Cannonier matchup that was allegedly in the works. I much rather prefer this matchup, Paulo Costa, Khamzat Chimaev. This might also be a trick. Wouldn't be surprised. But I'm going to say this. As far as I'm concerned, this will be the last chance for Paulo Costa. And I'm not even joking. At this point in Paulo Costa's career, if he pulls out of this fight, cut him. Cut him from the promotion. He's been so inactive whilst allegedly not really having any injuries that we knew about. And I feel like this is sort of the last straw for the UFC. They're saying, okay, Paulo Costa, you're not playing ball with us right now. You wouldn't fight Whittaker because of money. We gave you more money. You didn't want to fight Aliskerov for your own reasons, because, again, didn't deserve it, and I don't blame Paulo Costa for not wanting that matchup instead of a big fight against Khamzat Chimaev. So they've sort of offered him what he wants with a lot of money, in a good position on a pay-per-view card. The UFC could not appease Paulo Costa more. Let's be real here. They couldn't do any more to try and get Paulo Costa to fight. So if he doesn't take this one, and if he doesn't show up to this one, and it isn't a legitimate reason not to, like if he breaks his arm or something, I guess we won't cut him. But if it's not a legitimate reason to pull out, I reckon they're going to have to get rid of him, because he's causing a lot of problems and he's sort of holding up other careers. Because we could have, now we do have Aliskerov versus Roman Dolidze, but we could have had a full camp for Roman Dolidze. So it's getting in the way of other people's schedules, with Paulo Costa sort of being hit and miss over whether or not he's going to fight. But again, Paulo Costa is how old now in his career? I don't think he's that young. He's 32. He's 32 years of age. And he turned 32 a few months ago as well. So by the time he fights Khamzat Chimaev, he's going to be 32 and a half. So again, if he doesn't take this one, he's got to sling his hook, I think. So let's talk about the matchup. I actually love this matchup. I am going to go with Khamzat Chimaev. I did a break. Rest in peace, my second channel. But I did a breakdown of this a while ago on my second channel as to why, although Paulo Costa's takedown defense is amazing, it isn't for the style of takedowns that Khamzat Chimaev goes for. And that's what I'm going to break down for you guys right here. So either way, let's talk about this. The takedowns of Khamzat Chimaev. Khamzat Chimaev is not the type of guy, unless he's in a desperate situation like he was against Gilbert Burns when he got hurt by a punch, he's not really going to shoot double legs and single legs. You know what I mean? He's going to do a lot of his work from the body lock position. He's going to shoot for the body lock position. I know there must be a technical term for that transition and engage. It's the takedown that Mateusz Gamrot hit on Arman Tsarukyan in round 5, where he shoots in and slides round to the back to get the body lock. Paulo Costa, the times he has been taken down in his career have been from that position. We saw this against Marvin Vettori, where whenever Marvin Vettori shot a regular takedown on Paulo Costa, he couldn't really get it. But whenever Marvin Vettori worked towards a body lock on the back, he was more able to sort of like get down Paulo Costa. And I think the reason why Paulo Costa does so well against the double legs and the single legs is because his arms are so short and he likes to swing from the hips a lot, and he often goes for the body as well. It kind of gives him like a natural strong underhook. Short arms are really good for underhooks because they have a lower point of leverage. You know what I mean? This is some physics shit from back in the day. Their point of leverage is way lower. It's the range of motion of an arm. It's why people with shorter arms are better at being strongmen, especially when it comes to like bench press and overhead lifts as well, because simply they don't have to do the same range of motion and they can move a much larger amount of weight because they don't have to exert themselves as much. So that means that the double leg and single defense of Paulo Costa is a lot more effective than when someone's got a body lock on him, because one thing that short arms aren't good for is getting overhooks and reaching round to get the overhook on your opponent as they're round on your back, or trying to tuck the elbow maybe is going to be a little bit different. So I feel like it's harder for him to post in that position, and I think if Khamzat Chimaev can work round to his back and get that tight body lock that he's got on Kevin Holland, that he's got on other opponents, like remember Li Jingliang, it wasn't a double leg, it was a double leg into a transition into the back body lock position, and that's where he does his best work. So I do believe that if this is a 3-rounder, Khamzat Chimaev's going to win. Even if it's a 5-rounder, I think I'd pick him as well, because I do see him being able to get a finish here. But again, Paulo Costa's no joke in the takedown defense, and he is a danger on the feet. However, Khamzat Chimaev, after all this time, I feel like the time off, if it wasn't a visa issue, if it wasn't a USADA problem, it was because he knew he was going to move up to middleweight, and he has been bulking up that size. So I think he's going to be well sort of like conditioned and well adjusted to the middleweight division. And I think he's going to be able to take down Paulo Costa, because again, Paulo Costa's, again, not been active himself. If Paulo Costa had taken a fight in the meantime and showed us something good and then turned right back around to get a fight with Khamzat Chimaev, maybe I'd be a bit different about this. But at the end of the day, at this point in your career, in my honest opinion, as much as I maybe thought Marvin Vettori was quite good at some point, I still like Marvin Vettori, don't get me wrong, he's a good dude. But I think at this point, if you're at any point losing to Marvin Vettori in a striking matchup, you just don't have the diversity in your striking game to make a real threat to a guy who's got a lot of things for you to worry about. You know what I mean? In Khamzat Chimaev, who has the knockout power on the feet, has some kicks that he goes for as well. He's got a nasty front kick to the body that he goes for, has some nasty leg kicks that he was landing on Gilbert Burns as well, and he also has that takedown for you to worry about. So I think that Paulo Costa is going to be a bit too hesitant on the feet. He's not going to want to really push for some big exchanges with Khamzat Chimaev. He's going to want to try and pick his shot, and I think the back take situation is going to be where Khamzat Chimaev does his best work. And I also want to point out as well, as far as I'm concerned, I know he's fought much better competition in the welterweight division than he has at middleweight, but when you look at his career, where are the most dominant performances? John Phillips had nothing for him. It's John Phillips, I get it, but Gerald Meerschaert, people don't starch him in 10 seconds. People have knocked him out in the first round. Great fighters have lost to him. You know what I mean? But people don't smoke him in 10 seconds immediately into the fight. And that's something to take note of, because I think that really does represent the difference in the skill between welterweight and middleweight. And I think that's proven by the fact that Adesanya could make welterweight back in his old days. I know he's a big dude, but I remember he was fighting guys like Song Kanan in a bit of a catchweight situation before, and he's a welterweight in the UFC. Was it Kanan Song, or was it indeed another person? I think it was Song Kanan, and he finished him with a head kick. Either way, you see a lot of the smaller middleweights are the ones that actually do pretty good. You see Whittaker come up and do pretty good. Duplessis used to be a former welterweight as well. He fought Roberto Soldic at welterweight at KSW. At EFC, he had some fights at welterweight, some fights at middleweight. So and also Cannonier isn't a middleweight either. He used to be a heavyweight. He might be a natural sized middleweight, but he's moved from a division as well. And I think that's a really big tell over who's at the top. Marvin Vettori used to be a welterweight. You know what I mean? When he was coming up. A lot of the guys, Sean Strickland used to be a welterweight when he was coming up. A lot of the guys that actually have success in the middleweight division, look at them. Adesanya is the exception, and he's not really a huge middleweight himself. I mean, he claims 6'4", but he's 6'2". You know what I mean? He's 6'2.5" maybe. I'm taller than Adesanya. And Dricus Duplessis, welterweight. Alex Pereira is a natural natural light heavyweight, let's be real. Whittaker welterweight, Cannonier, natural light heavyweight, came down a bit, trimmed down for the division. Not too big, but Marvin Vettori welterweight, Sean Strickland. There's a lot of these fighters, you know what I mean? So I think that Khamzat Chimaev's actually going to fit right in the welterweight division. But the problem I have with this is, let me know if I'm wrong on this, but I feel like this is the big problem with this matchup being made instead of the Cannonier one. And the only reason I disagree with this matchup instead of the Cannonier one is because Paulo Costa's ranked number 7. And that's a problem in my opinion. I think that's a big problem because if he wins, does he get a title shot or not? Or is Israel Adesanya going to go, you've got to earn it. I was going to fight Strickland when he was coming off a win over Imavov, but because you're a wrestler, you have to earn the shot. Botched. You know what I mean? Like, he might play that game where he says, Khamzat, you're number 7. I need to see you beat Cannonier or Whittaker. And maybe we do get a Khamzat-Whittaker matchup before we even see him fight Israel Adesanya if he wins this one. So I will be going with Khamzat Chimaev. But I honestly, with this matchup, I know I'm making a video about it, but I ain't believing it until Bruce Buffer's announcing their names. I'll be real. We move on to another bit of news I just wanted to touch on at the end of this video, which was MVP to UFC. We saw that MVP was a free agent. We've also had some people, I actually felt bad earlier. I didn't mean to do this, Jesse. Because Jesse made a live stream, Jesse on Fire this is, that said, UFC buys Bellator. And I was like, dude, those names have been on the website for a long time and all the records are wrong. And it kind of like deflated his title a little bit, and I didn't mean to do that. I just was like sharing a bit of information. So I feel like I need to give the sort of full story about this whole Bellator UFC situation. Do I think there's a solid chance that UFC is buying Bellator? I do. Do I think that the evidence that people are sort of pointing out is the reason why I think they're doing that? I don't, because we've seen a lot of those names on the UFC website before. A lot of people have predated screenshots of some of those names on the UFC website, and maybe it's just like an MMA crossover algorithm thing that ended up there. And a lot of the names like MVP and the Pitbull Brothers, if you actually look at their records on the UFC website, they're incorrect records. They're not matching up to their actual MMA records. So there are some inaccuracies in some of those screenshots. But I do want to mention this. First of all, let's talk about who could be a potential opponent for MVP. Second of all, I'm going to talk about the UFC buying the PFL and what that would do to Bellator. Buying the Bellator, and what that would do to the PFL. But first, MVP is sort of the big draw that the UFC can get out of Bellator. He's coming off a loss. This is the problem I have with the MVP move. 6 years ago, please. I know he has a Pokemon and he wears he has a Pokemon ball and hat after a win and he wears his gauntlet, but he's 36 years of age. You know what I mean? He's at the end of his career here. And I would have loved to have seen this crossover when he was 30. And it's really annoying that we don't get to see it. So, in my opinion, I don't think you give him a guy in the top 10 straight away. I think you give him sort of a top 15 floater, and you give him a matchup where you can justify him being a main event. Because, although I know the UFC is going to be playing hardball with MVP, because they don't want to give him a crazy amount of money. They never like doing that. Remember, Pimlet was a huge name, selling out arenas in the UK before he even got to the UFC, and they were offering him like 20 for 20 in his debut, and that was just a disgrace for him, because I'm sure he was making at least 50 grand in the UK on his regional fights, selling tickets, like just purely off ticket sales, he was making bank. So, I want to mention, MVP, the UFC aren't going to fork out a load of cash. But I think what they can do to entice him over to the UFC and make him not want to re-sign with Bellator is give him a matchup where they can justify it as a main event of a fight night. And I think it's going to be a fun matchup. You know what I mean? If they can make it a fight night main event, I think that without the money, maybe MVP will be a bit sad that he's not making as much as he wants to, as maybe PFL will offer him. But MVP is a showman. And that is what he is at the end of the day. And he likes to perform on a big platform in front of as many people as possible. So, even if you don't offer him the most amount of money, UFC, because I know they're a bit stingy with that, offering him a main event, I think MVP's brain is going to go ding, 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 you know what I mean? And think about the money symbols and the algorithm and the interactions that he's going to get on social media, because they could do a fight night main event with MVP versus Wonderboy. They could even do a fight night main event with MVP versus Mikel Pereira if Pereira beats Wonderboy. They could do MVP versus if Vicente Luque beats Rafael Dos Anjos in a fight night main events coming up soon. So if you're available to have a Vicente Luque fight night main event against Dos Anjos, if he wins, surely you're okay to put him in another fight night main event. So I'm thinking maybe if Vicente Luque, because I think this would be a perfect matchup where it's enough danger from Luque for MVP, who's sort of like a bit of a Douglas Lima-esque type fighter, but maybe a little bit less snappy with the kicks and a little bit more snappy with the punches, is how I would describe that. I think if you give him Vicente Luque, it's a good striking, stationary sort of fighter that MVP can actually show up against. I don't know I'd pick MVP to win that one. I don't know if he'd KO Luque. Luque has got a granite chin. So I would maybe see potentially Luque finishing him as the fight went on and chopping at his calf and maybe eventually latching up a shot on the chin and then going for the Darce choke or something. So maybe the skill level from Bellator to UFC might be a bit too much of a jump for MVP. But I think there's a lot of options that you can have. You could even put him on the main card of a pay-per-view. This is what you got to do with MVP. You got to tap in. Ego is not an insult here. It's everyone has an ego, and it's good to have an ego as a fighter. You need it to carry you in your career. You need that main character syndrome. So if he's watching this MVP, I'm not meaning this as an insult. Ego-wise, that's going to speak to MVP's ego. So he's going to think, okay, 100K at PFL, or 70K at the UFC, or maybe like 150K for the PFL, or 50 for 50 at the UFC, 70 for 70 at the UFC. What am I going to take? PFL's offering me more money, but main card of a pay-per-view. You know what I mean? With a huge championship name at the top. Maybe Israel Adesanya at the end of the year. Who knows? Another name, John Jones at MSG. Maybe you put him on the main card there against Wonderboy. That's going to speak more than the dollar signs from PFL to MVP. So that's what the UFC's got to do. They got to tackle this from the angle of, we're going to give you a spotlight and the money. Not just take it, look at the money, we'll give you a fight. We'll give you a main event of a fight night in the Apex, or we'll give you a main card of a pay-per-view at MSG, or maybe on the McGregor card in December, because he is from the UK. I know McGregor's from Ireland, but it's a similar niche fan base, so they might be able to translate over to MVP. So that's where you're going to entice MVP. Other than that, I want to talk about this as well. If the UFC buy Bellator, it's over for PFL. And I think the rumors of the UFC buying Bellator are almost as effective as them buying it as well. Not as effective, because, of course, buying it will absolutely destroy PFL outright. But, my mustache is twirling up. But, the rumors of them buying it even are going to make PFL think, man, they're in the market. You know what I mean? They're in the chase for Bellator with us. So, where PFL might have thought, no one else is buying Bellator, we can offer them a decent amount that we think is sort of okay to offer them, and we can get Bellator. Now, even if the UFC's not going to buy Bellator, and they're just putting that out there as a rumor, PFL's going to think, well, shit, maybe we're in competition. Maybe we need to spend a bit more on Bellator to make sure we've got it. So they could play the market like that, but they could also play it by just buying Bellator. I think they've got to do it. It's been a long time since the UFC have forked out a bunch of money. And you know what? I don't even want them to buy Bellator. I reckon, as much as people say, you know, Bellator fighters earn a lot more, they do, but it's not in the millions. Only the Grand Prix winners are getting that, and that's along with their fight check. So, what you got to do is buy the key fighters. Nemkov, Yaroslav Amosov, Usman Nurmagomedov, maybe a mixture of those bantamweights in Patricky Mix and Raytheon Stotts and a lot of those names that are at bantam. Maybe you get Sergio Pettis back as well, because he's only built his name since leaving the UFC. So, you get the key names. Did I mention Nemkov? I think I did. You get some of those key names. Johnny Eblen. Now you get Spice to the middleweight division. You put him against a top 5 guy. There's a lot of names they could really rake in here. And I don't think it'd cost them that much. We're not talking hundreds of millions here. They don't have to buy Bellator. They need to buy the fighters. That's the move they make. They need to get the names I just mentioned. I reckon they could do it for about 20 mil. Honestly. Crazy amount of money, I know, but in the grand scheme of things, when they're run by Disney, it's not that much money when you know how much money some of these big corporations are making. So, 20 mil, get the key names, give them a great contract, and you know what? I wouldn't mind a themed card with all of those names in a crowded event. Maybe not a pay-per-view. If it was a pay-per-view, you'd have to have some actual title fights. And I don't think the Bellator guys are going to get title fights straight away. I think the UFC is going to put them against a top 10 opponent each if they do go down this avenue. What they should do is buy out those key fighters and make a themed fight night card of like a Bellator welcome party. pretty much, where they get the key fighters and lay them out across the card, main event, co-main, feature fight, another fight, main card opener, and you have them all take on a decent fighter in their respective divisions, and that will introduce them to the UFC audience, and then you can start moving them into the top 5, and then we can talk title shots. That's the move to make. That's what the UFC needs to do, and I think that would be the most effective. Like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and if the UFC pulls this off with Bellator, even if they might not be doing it, if they do, PFL, it was nice knowing you. You know what I mean? You're going to need a lot more than Jake Paul and Ngannou to compete with that. See you later. Goodbye. Toodle pip.